Hi everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Absolute Beginners. So for this week, we're finally going to get into making things look three-dimensional by using simple forms. We're going to start off by practicing drawing some boxes and pyramids, and then moving on to rounded forms such as spheres, cylinders, and cones. By the end of this, we will be continuing to draw some still lifes, breaking them down with the use of tracing, and then draw them from observation in order to put our line work to a level where we can start to render them. As we continue this week working on our line work and creating forms with depth, we'll be able to learn how light affects them the following week. And eventually we'll get to a finished piece after doing some value studies. So go ahead and get your pencils and pages ready, as we're going to do quite a lot of drawing for this week's assignments. Chapter 1, Boxes and Pyramids. Alright, so let the fun begin. So just like last week, we've learned to do some two-dimensional shapes, starting with a square, a triangle, and of course, circles. Now from these two-dimensional shapes, we can think of them kind of like the alphabets, and now we're going to combine them to make sort of words. So from these 2D shapes, we're going to then be able to convert some very simple 3D forms. So with a square, we can get a cube, now from here, even though there are certain angles, I'm trying to keep those sides parallel. From a triangle, we have a pyramid. So just like the cube, the bottom of the pyramid is a square or a rectangle, depending on how long you want to make it. But from there, you can get the center and make a line that is perpendicular. And then you can connect it from the edges. So it's kind of like a tent from the stick on the top, and then you're drawing it out to the sides. Now with the circle, with all these rounded forms, we're going to get quite a few. So the first one being a cylinder. This is a very common geometrical form. And then from there, just like a pyramid, but with a rounded bottom, we're going to get a cone. So notice I also put the line in the center just to help me extract how tall that cone will be. And then lastly, we get a sphere. It's really hard to show the roundness with just line work, but putting an ellipse in there helps. And from there, we basically get the 5 forms out of these 3 simple shapes. Next, I just want to show you all these geometrical forms physically. So I got these off of Amazon. Here's a cube, and these are fairly inexpensive. They're just made out of foam. So if you extend the cube, you of course get more of a rectangular box like this. You can see that the lines and the faces are pretty much the same. And then from there, they share the square bottom, which is this pyramid with a triangular sides on the surfaces. So square bottom, triangle side. Next, we'll have the rounded forms, which will be, the most common one is of course a sphere or a ball shape. Next to that common form is a cylinder, which we see all around us, anywhere from cups, mugs, pipes, all sorts of things. So you got your ellipse there for the roundness, all the way around. So you got the ellipse down here for the cone. And those are our main 5 forms. Now, You don't have to buy these forms just to draw them, so we're going to learn how to construct them. Based on what we did in the previous week of drawing straight lines and curves, we can easily draw these out. So looking at my reference here with this geoform, cubes and boxes, we're just going to start off with a series of straight lines. Just a reminder, make sure you use the same techniques that we've been learning up to this point. So straight line exercise is where it's at. Okay, so looking at this cube here, when you start to construct it, you want to pay attention to the bottom and top lines, as these need to be parallel. We won't go too heavily in perspective, but as long as you keep these lines parallel, the box will start to read. So we're going to do the same thing, but draw something with a slightly different proportion. Basically drawing a larger rectangular box. And notice how I'm dotting things off again, just to kind of gauge how long or small something needs to be before I draw it out. And also a good idea is to draw through. Now this will be an emphasis for this week, is pretty much drawing the other side that we can't actually see. So it's kind of like drawing this box made out of glass. Now a few things to watch out for when you start practicing drawing some boxes is, if you'll notice here, the lines are just kind of going all over the place and pointing in different directions, right? So you want to make sure they're not doing this, because if they're not parallel, they start to look a little bit wonky and distorted. So again, keep them as parallel as you can. And for those of you that are, have done a little bit of perspective, basically what's happening is these lines are converging to a single point. And if you notice here, these are spreading away from each other, which means they're not going to the same vanishing point. So again, we're just going to do some freehand boxes using the techniques we've learned from week 1. Try a few different sizes: small, large, long, like this one over here. And again, all 4 of these lines, even though I don't see the one in the back, I want to make sure they're all parallel. And from there, I can start to construct accordingly. So I'm always going back to what I previously drew and just trying to check each angle to make sure I can get those lines reading parallel. Okay, so as you see here with these forms, they pretty much have very similar surfaces. Now with the pyramid, it does have a square bottom but a triangular side. So that's another exercise that we'll be continuing with. So that's another thing we'll be practicing drawing as well. All right, so with the pyramid, it shares a square bottom. So it's just like building the bottom of a cube. And then from here, I'm going to draw an X. Now the reason I'm drawing this X is it'll help me find the center of that square in kind of in perspective, right? Without having to measure like with a ruler. So here in 2D, I'll just show you kind of like the principle behind that. So instead of having to measure like a cross, we can just draw an X, and that'll help us find the center without any sort of instruments. From there, you could then draw a cross just to kind of make sure that we're getting the complete center. Now, the reason that center line is important is we're going to use it to extract a perpendicular line. Okay, so you kind of have to imagine it at the very center of this pyramid. So just drawing it straight up and down, like so. We can then connect the corners of the square to the peak of that center line. So even the one in the back that we can't see. And then from there, you basically have the construction of a pyramid. All right, so from here, we can also draw pyramids from different angles. So as you see with this square, it's quite on an extreme angle here to the side, but I can still use the same methods of drawing the square first to find the center line. As I extract it to find a perpendicular line, I can then connect the corners to that peak. Now from there, you can also darken up the lines that we actually see. So it's good to construct them and draw through like it's made out of glass. But with your pencil or pen, try to beef up the line quality by going over it a few more times. That way things will start to kind of pop and it'll be easier for the viewer to kind of see them. So basically I want an entire page of boxes and an entire page of pyramids. So try to construct them in different angles, different sizes and proportions. And try to keep the line exercises in mind as well as the steps on how to construct them. And try not to skip these at first, just make sure you follow it step by step. That way when you get the hang of it, things will start to get easier. So even without a complete knowledge of in-depth perspective, as long as you keep some of these lines parallel to each other, especially with these more flat surface forms, such as these boxes and pyramids, things can start to read pretty three-dimensionally quickly. As long as you keep your lines straight and parallel. So again, you can start to also skip those steps eventually, as long as you can kind of see through the forms. I prefer you guys to just really draw through as much as you can. So do a couple of pages of warm-ups for these, and I'll be taking a look on how you're constructing them. Chapter 2, Ellipses and Round Forms. Alright, so next we're going to get into these rounded forms, which have curved surfaces. So if you see here with the cylinder, we have an important shape, which is the circle, that connects and kind of unifies what these rounded forms are about. Now if you look with the sphere, obviously a circle in shape, and it's basically made of infinite circles. So if you look here with the equator kind of cut out, so you got like this bowl shape, and it's fairly flat, but you got a 2D circle in there. So the same thing with the cone. You've got that ellipse that goes throughout from one end to the other. So before we can actually start drawing these curved forms, we have to understand something about a circle. So with the circle, when it is drawn in perspective or at a slightly different angle, so just like a square, where it starts to look like a diamond shape based off of the angle. A circle has a shape called an ellipse. Now, an ellipse is, again, just a circle in perspective. So if you look here, the cylinder with onto the camera, it's very, just a full circle shape. But as soon as we start to tilt it, it gets narrower and narrower. Now that is basically the ellipse. And depending on the type of angle that we see it at, just like this one, it's just pretty much flat. It'll start to have a different degree depending on how we turn it. When you start practicing drawing ellipses, we're going to do the same thing like we did in the week 1, drawing some circle as an exercise. You're going to continue with a circular motion, touch down, and try to find a degree in which you can draw these ellipses. So just kind of go around the page and try a few that are narrow or wider, closer to a circle. So practicing these ellipses will help you with drawing these forms. Okay, so one thing to understand about a circle is it basically fits within a square. So if we were to draw a rectangle, an ellipse will not fit in there because it's not a circle, right? It's more of an oval. So that's one common mistake or misunderstanding we need to correct ourselves, is that an oval and a circle, are basically not the same thing, which means an ellipse is not an oval. So an oval is sort of a more like egg shape, or kind of just a different rounded form. So the thing about ovals is it's basically just a different type of rounded shape. And that means that an ellipse is very specific to a circle, which means it has these geometrical symmetries to it that we need to understand. So from here, I'm drawing a cross, which is basically the minor and major axis. So we're not going to get too in-depth with it, but those are the things to keep in mind when we're drawing these ellipses. And all 4 of these quadrants have to be pretty much equal. Now, when we have a box on its side, we can do the same construction by finding the center, which is by drawing an X and then the cross. Okay, so once you have that construction, you can then fit an ellipse into that square. So for those of you that have a bit more perspective experience, you can draw some ellipses into some box or square planes. But from here, I just want to see a page of ellipses to warm up, so that way we can really draw these rounded forms. Just remember to take your time and do the same techniques we've been doing since week 1, and try to get the hang of the flow just like we did with these circles. Now that we've got some warm-ups and understanding ellipses a bit, we're going to go ahead and actually draw these forms now. So for the first one, we're starting with a cone. So start off with an ellipse, just like you see here. So the thing about the cone is it has that main ellipse on the bottom, and then the sides are basically triangular in silhouette. But just like the pyramid, what we're going to do is try to find the center first in order to construct this. Now, if you remember from the pyramid, we had to find the center of the square on the bottom in order to construct the rest of it. So we're going to do the same thing, and for now you can eyeball the center of the ellipse. Draw the perpendicular line, and this will dictate on how tall your cone will be. So from the edges, just mark it off, and then you could draw the rest of the silhouette for this cone in order to finish drawing the rest of the form. So starting off with an ellipse, you can also draw the major axis like this with the minor axis in the middle. So that's the shorter side. So finding the center, you can make a dot and draw the rest of the cone accordingly. Now if you look here, if you tilt the cone little by little, we can also start to try different degrees of ellipses. So as you see here, this one is a bit rounder, but I'm going to keep it to the side, make sure that it's perpendicular, and construct it accordingly. Now when we have these cones, we are drawing through with the ellipse. So we have to do a little bit of line quality and determine what's in the front and what's not being seen. Kind of like drawing those boxes like they're made out of glass. So I'm going back in here and darkening up the line in the front to show that the line here in the back is the light one, which is the part we don't see. And then the dark line is, of course, the one in front. So drawing another ellipse here, we can do the opposite where we are looking at the bottom of the cone. And the construction is basically the same thing. However, whatever line I'm emphasizing, so I'm going to draw 4 dashes here in order for me to connect that ellipse with darker lines. So just like the curve exercise that we did the first week, you can punch up that line quality. So here we basically have the bottom of the cone just tilting away. And you could always come back in and erase some of that construction line or lighten it up. That way it's really clear to the viewer how this form is supposed to read. So I encourage everyone to start this off with some pencils, and then once you get comfortable, you can try a few with a ballpoint pen or even one of those felt tip pens. So try a whole page of cones, varying in degrees. And then once you do that, you're going to go back in and draw some extra ellipses on the inside and center of these cones. So with a light pencil or a light ballpoint pen, just kind of go back in here and practice the ellipse exercise, drawing through and putting some ellipses inside. So these are great to do if we need to draw some stripes or just really understand the form of a cone a little bit more. And again, so I'm drawing these contour lines on the outside and darkening them to show that this is what the viewer is supposed to see that's in the front. Okay, so try a page of cones before moving on to the next form. Alright, so moving on to the next rounded form, we have here a cylinder Now this one's very common, and again, we see this pretty much everywhere on our daily lives. And the main thing is we have, two symmetrical or even circles on both ends. So basically when we're drawing these, you can start off with an ellipse. Just like a box, we can mark off the edges with some straight lines. And then that's where we can draw the second ellipse. When we have these ellipses in here, just like the cone, we're also going to be thinking about what's in front and what's not being shown. So after drawing through, we're going to punch in some line quality and darken up these curves. So with this ellipse, I'm looking up at it, so we only see the front edge on top, but we'll see the rest of the bottom, so I'm darkening the ellipse on the bottom of the cylinder. And then from there, don't forget the edges of the cylinder to darken that line quality up. So here, just again marking off the 4 quadrants using the curve exercise, we can do our best to construct this ellipse. And then from here, the wider ellipse will be further away from us, so that will be the darker edge. Now, one thing to notice about drawing cylinders is you want to draw through, because if you just sort of draw them, because if you just draw the edges without really thinking about the degree of those ellipses, your cylinder could look flat and a little bit off. And also with varying degrees, where one is very narrow and one is a lot wider, if we're just trying to draw symmetrical cylinders, this won't work out as well. So a quick perspective lesson, and it's really important when understanding these ellipses. So we have a line here, which is the horizon line, or HL for short. So when an ellipse is closer to the horizon line, it's a lot narrower. And the further the ellipse is from the horizon line, it's going to be a lot wider. So again, if you've ever taken a perspective class or seen a diagram with like railroad tracks, as it goes closer to the horizon line, things start to get narrower. So as you see here on this second example on the right, where it's the opposite, where the ellipse is wider closer to the horizon line, and then you have an ellipse that's narrower away from the horizon line, it definitely looks off because the perspective is wrong. So again, even if we're not plotting anything, it's easy for the viewer and ourselves to really see or feel that something's wrong with these ellipses. Okay. But as starting off, you could draw these ellipses about the same degree and connect them accordingly to start constructing your cylinders. So again, an ellipse is not an oval, and just to prove that a cone, a circle on a cone fits on a square. So for those of you that want a bit of a challenge or a bit more advanced with constructing the boxes now, we can construct a cylinder starting off with a box form. So once you have your box form here, make sure that the edges are squares. You will draw an X to find the center, draw the cross, mark it off. And once you have that, we can start drawing these ellipses accordingly. So I do have to turn my page quite a bit in order to draw this ellipse comfortably. And then from there, just getting the further edge of the box and then connecting these ellipses to get a cylinder. So if you want something a little bit more accurate, this is a way you can construct it by drawing a box first. But in the end, I just want to see a page full of cylinders, and just do your best in terms of getting the degrees. Again, we're not going to go too much in depth with perspective as of now. Just make sure that you keep some of these lessons in mind when drawing these. All right, so last but not least, we have the sphere, and it's probably the most common form that we'll see anywhere. So stars and planets are all spherical shape. So if we draw spheres, we can basically just draw circles. But that doesn't really help us in understanding how to construct these. So I have this other form here where it's cut off kind of at the halfway or equator point. So as you see here, there is a circle that we can see that's chopped off, and is basically an ellipse, just like our other forms. So when we get into motion and sketch out a circle, what we'll do is draw an equator and show the halfway point with an ellipse. So going back into the circles, we'll draw an ellipse accordingly to draw through and construct the form. These exercises will be pretty quick, but another thing we can do is pretend that we have a pencil or a stick that goes through the sphere. So I'm drawing a little dot, so showing like a needle that's poking through the sphere. So if we were to draw through this, we won't see that needle until the further edge. So this is just another way you could show a diagram of a sphere regarding overlaps. So you can see he's going straight through the center, and I'm going to punch it up with some line quality. So drawing where that hole is. And I'm drawing the ellipse based on how the sphere is facing based on that hole. Okay, so I'm even going to draw a ground plane here. So now we have, it almost looks like a top. For this page, we're going to constantly draw circles with ellipses in the center to represent the sphere. So again, it's like the chopped off version of the ball with this bowl shape. And it's something we could really start to feel out. And a great part of this exercise, we're also going to draw some of those dome shapes or bowl shapes. So I want you to draw these spheres chopped in half. Draw the bottom kind of like you would draw the cylinder or the bottom of a cone, and punch your line quality accordingly. So again, I'm marking off the edges so I can get these curves a little bit darker on top of the construction. Once you get the hang of it, you could also skip some of that construction steps or draw just like we did or draw it just the way we did the cones by drawing a center line. So from here, just keep warming up and draw your circles accordingly. Another way to draw this is kind of like a 3D wireframe. So for any of you 3D modelers out there. So another way to draw some contour lines on this, kind of like the edge of the ellipse, is think of like a beach ball or some kind of sports ball, like a basketball. And some of these stripes will have a thicker side to it, and as the further away it gets a little bit narrower. So it's kind of showing a little bit of perspective with the sphere with contour lines. And again, just drawing an equator and showing the, what's in front and what's behind. And if you were to add more ellipses on here, this starts to become kind of like a 3D wireframe. So for all of you 3D artists out there, this is basically what we're doing. For these pages, I like to see different forms of these spheres in different ways. So you can chop it in half, you can draw a 3D wireframe or a needle that's kind of sticking through. That way we can really start to feel how round the sphere is and really figure out how to construct them. But you can keep them as simple as you can or make them as complex as you want. The more you can get creative, but the more you do, the more you'll really understand on how to connect these for future applications. So here I'm drawing another one where sort of a stick is poking through, but in a different direction. And again, just try a variety. You can do these half domes as well. Or the wireframes. So go ahead and fill up a page of spheres in quite a variety. And then you'll start to really prepare yourself on even learning how to light these and draw them in perspective. Chapter 3, Drawing Through Forms. Okay, so for this chapter, we're going to talk about really taking our time with the forms and really trying to get them to draw through. So just like last week, I want you to get some tracing paper if you're doing this traditionally, or you can use Photoshop and treat it just like tracing paper would. Now for this, if you're using Photoshop, I have a little tip. So besides taking the opacity of the image layer and just bringing it down, now another method you can do is create a completely new layer on top, and you're going to go to Edit, Fill, or for my shortcut it's Shift 5. You can pick a color, and I'm just going to make it white. Hit OK. Now what this does is I have a completely white image over here, and I'm going to treat it like tracing paper. So tracing paper is is transparent, so I'm going to lower the opacity like so, maybe about 40%. So it's almost like I have a layer of tracing paper. So I'm just going to name it tracing paper. But instead of drawing on the tracing paper, any sort of line I draw on here will also be fairly transparent. So I need to make another layer. You can call this a drawing layer. So it'll be a little bit more solid. Okay, so onto the actual drawing. Now from here, we're going to take each of these images and trace them like we did last week when we did shapes. But what we're going to do is really practice those forms like we learned in the previous chapters. So this is a fairly basic image with a lot of geoforms. First thing I like to do is try to get the area with the line on the back. So it's a fairly long line. Do my best to try to capture that. So even if you're doing this in tracing paper with graphite, I definitely want you to do your best to try to get the line in the background, just so we know where the table is versus the background. Next, it's a good idea to start with the largest forms. So from here, I'm going to take this line. This is the most obvious. And draw these accordingly. So again, even though this is week 3, we still want to make sure we're building good habits, connecting our lines with dots and really just building as much as we can. Now, the principle of drawing through is basically drawing parts of the image that is invisible, right? So instead of stopping here with the yellow object where the cube ends, we're going to draw all the way through like so. And as simple as drawing through is, it's often neglected in even more advanced courses from a lot of students. Especially for those that are really into figure drawing, drawing characters. This is what's going to make or break, how much depth you have in the forms you draw. So even though we're tracing, again, you want to really assess what's happening with the forms here. Now this form is a little bit tricky, right? It's almost like a half cylinder that's cut off. So here, I really have to think about how the bottom looks. And it's more of like a square, right? Like a bottom of a cube. But it starts with and ends with a curve as well. Okay. Now moving on to some of these other forms. So this is more of a triangle. So when you're drawing these, you kind of have to pretend they're made out of glass and really try to imagine how it looks from a different angle. So this will be the difference between someone who just blindly traces or copies this image without really thinking it through. So this will be a very simple warm-up in understanding these forms. So these are one of the things I'll take a look at in your assignments if you're just ending the image like this. But I really want you guys to draw through as much as you can. So from here, what's missing will be the line connecting on the other side. Okay. Now if you look here at this red object, it's basically a giant rectangular form or a long box. So from here, a lot of it's really covered up. So I really want to make sure I get my lines straight to try to find where it connects with the rest of the image. So this line is an indication of the direction of the perspective, right? So I want to make that line as parallel as I can on the bottom. So if I do something like this, I know it's going to be way off, right? I want to make it as the same angle as I can. And that'll help me get these lines. Okay. Same thing here. Find this angle, and then this one that we don't see. Connecting them all the way through. And then now we have that box. So what's left for me are these rounded objects, such as these two cones and the cylinder. There isn't really a right or wrong order in which of these forms you do first. I just wanted to tackle the ones with the straighter lines. If you need to, you can work in multiple layers. That way when you erase something here, it doesn't affect the other lines. And you can do this traditionally as well. If you need to work on multiple tracing paper pages, that might help as well. So from here, when I'm drawing this ellipse, things could get a little bit messy. Okay, so I'm going to block it in really quick. Trying to get that ellipse. Now, drawing ellipses in Photoshop freehand can be a lot trickier with a stylus, even if you have a Cintiq. If you have a tablet, it's definitely a lot more difficult. But I'm kind of going back in here to just fix that up a little, clean it up. And again, you could always use your eraser to clean up the mess. But I'd rather have a sketchy ellipse like this versus one that's kind of just drawn with heavy lines and they're pointy at the ends. So this is not what we want. So from here, just taking a look at what I have. This was probably the hardest one to draw through, that cube that because a lot of it is, missing, but all of these points help me find it. Now from there, I could also see that this cone is hanging off the edge. Since I've, have that, drawn through with the cube. Trying to find the degree of the ellipse. Just trying to get that flow. Just like we did from the previous chapter, trying to find that center. Okay. From there, I'm gonna try to get this. So there are ellipse tools in Photoshop that you can use, but for now, it's better to just try to get everything freehand. We're just trying to build our dexterity, penmanship, or pencil, to try to get these forms to read. Okay. I'm actually going to merge these layers down, so it's just one. Okay. So from here, let's say I were to take away the actual image and seeing if I missed any lines. But from there, I'm going to go back in and try to draw these shadows. For this next section, I've gone ahead and sped up the video because the last thing I need to do before calling this finished is just go over my lines a little bit. And I've named this layer line quality. And so what I'm going for is darkening the lines that we actually see. And I'll go back and forth and erase out to lighten up some of the lines that I initially drew. So for this assignment, I definitely want everyone to draw through. That's the main thing I'll be looking for this week. But on top of that, once you start, blocking in all of your forms, I want you to go back in, darken up the lines that matter, but then also lighten up by erasing some of the lines that you use for construction. So as you see here, I'm doing quite a bit of cleanup. The ellipses on my cylinders were the ones that I weren't happy with the most, as they were quite a struggle doing them freehand. And then from there, also just kind of double checking anything I might have missed, some of the shadows that I'm drawing through, and going back and forth by lightening up some of those lines where they intersect some of the forms. And once you have that done, just double check your work, and then you can call this image finished. I'll be doing another demo of this, and this one's going to be sped up because, the steps are the same. However, since the first image was fairly simple, they're all geoforms already, I would encourage you guys to also try some of the still life images where we have more complex objects. So for this one, we have a little pot here with a few other objects, and these forms now are connected to each other. So drawing through is very crucial and very important here. So we're going through the same steps of drawing our ellipses all the way through, making sure we have the proper forms like cylinders and spheres connected to each other. So as you see here, I'm going kind of back and forth with each object and really trying to figure out how to break up the shapes and forms all together. There's going to be a combination of triangular wedges with ellipses on different sides and just different proportions overall whenever there's a change in the form. Now, even though this one's sped up, I just want to show you all, just how I'm working through the same steps of drawing through, keeping my line work fairly loose and all freehand, and thinking about how it might look on the other side. And then from there, just using a new layer for putting some line quality in there. So instead of erasing everything out, you could always, if you're using Photoshop, you can make that initial block in a lot lighter, changing the opacity and making it lower. If you're doing this with pencil, you could simply put an extra sheet of tracing paper on top. One thing I would also recommend doing is, even if you're doing this traditionally, you could pull that initial photograph or image and just take it out, so that way you're just focused on the line work. Because sometimes the values or the colors from the image will be a little bit distracting, and that way this can just help you focus on line quality and then getting the solid forms down. So after you do a second image breakdown, make sure it's a little bit more challenging than the first. That way you can kind of build up your understanding and just getting used to finding those forms each time. Chapter 4, Observational Form Breakdown. All right, here we are in the final chapter of this week and the final challenge as well. So for this one, since we've been warming up to this point, we're going to be drawing from observation. So you can set up a simple still life or use one of the photographs that was provided. You can do this traditionally or digitally, but again, just like last week, at the very end of the chapter for week 2, we're going to use our observational skills. This means we will need to start by doing some thumbnails to really find the appropriate framing we have for our objects. So here, starting off, I'm blocking in some simple shapes. Here I'm going to start off with the mug, which is the largest shape, which makes it easier for me to get the placement and proportions of the rest of the objects around it. From here, remember to draw small. I'm going to zoom in for the demo purposes, but try to work around the size of a business card. No bigger and not too small. Blocking in the shadows is a great idea at this point because they are part of the composition. I'm also blocking in the forms and shapes as I see fit. You can keep these loose, but just remember to draw through. So by now, hopefully you've been warming up and feeling comfortable on seeing through the forms. So that's a very generic thumbnail I have here, which encompasses all the objects. I'm going to try one now that is a little bit, so I'm going to try one now that has a little bit of a different framing. I'm going to try a vertical frame. See if I can get a different feel. And as you see here, I'm drawing the ellipse outside of the frame. It's just really drawing through and making sure I'm getting the forms correct. So if you're deciding to crop your image or the objects in the image, make sure to draw outside of it. That way you get a truer version of the forms you're trying to draw. From here, what I'm thinking about is the spacing between the frame. So the negative shape or space, like we've mentioned in the previous week, is really important because it's not just the objects themselves, but the things around it that makes the composition, a whole image. I'm blocking in the shadow. I didn't do that in the previous one, but if you look at the shadow inside the cup, it has a very dynamic shape to it. So it's a very integral part of the composition. Right, from here, I'm going to try one more thumbnail, going back to more of a horizontal composition. And here I'm going to try a close-up of the bottom of the mug, trying to get a different feel. Even though I feel like this is one I won't use, I just want to see how it looks. So feel free to experiment at this point and, just try to figure out something that might work or might not. Doesn't hurt to try, spending a few minutes to just see a extra possibility. And then from here, for my assessment, as much as I like the third one for a painting, I feel like it doesn't work that well for the type of drawing we're doing, which is drawing the forms, and it doesn't really show enough of the shapes. I've decided to go with the middle composition. So I'm going to try to copy the aspect ratio. And you could do this either on a separate sheet, or if you have a large enough sheet, you can just have it with the thumbnails. So starting off with the largest object, which is the mug, I'm going to try to block it in, just really drawing through even outside of the border, getting my ellipses down, and it's basically a tapered cylinder. From there, I'm going to get the larger lines, which is the background, and that'll help me get all these smaller objects in place. Definitely utilize the lessons we've learned from the previous week, where we're learning how to find those angles to help us find the other objects. So you'll notice I'm dotting off different sections, so I'm kind of estimating where these objects are kind of landing in relation to each other. So blocking in my ellipses here, finding the center. It's not a bad idea to quickly bounce around to each different object to really block them in. As you see here, even though it's just a half sphere, I decided to try to block it in with a full circle, just so I can get that true flow and not have to kind of scratch my way just drawing that curve. You could always erase it out just to clean up your initial lay-in. The thing about lay-ins is, no matter what, you're going to have a lot of rough lines, and that's very normal. That's why a lot of illustrators and animators, they'll use a very light pencil, sometimes a blue color pencil as well, just to do some of that initial lay-in, rough it out before going into some heavy line work. So between the large cube and the mug, even in this small section, I'm just trying to find some forms that I could block in. Even though I don't have the true shape to see in terms of the actual connection of that mug, I can quickly block in an ellipse to try and get that connection to read. Then from here, I'm just kind of slowing down and taking my time to really check if my placement is um, accurate enough. You'll see me here drawing this cube over again and kind of nudging it to the right. Since I'm moving that around, I'll have to move the mug as well, because there's quite a bit of a gap between the edge of the mug inside of the handle and also the edge of the cube. So drawing this digitally is, just as difficult as drawing traditionally. Often I actually find it easier drawing line work using just plain pencils and pens. Even with a Cintiq, there's a bit of parallax between the line and the actual pen that you're using. There's always a nice precision that you can get with just paper, and also that texture quality is always great. And the thing about traditional media is it translates really easily to digital media. And all the lessons you learn traditionally, it just easily applies. So for those of you that feel like, it's really intimidating to use Photoshop or any kind of digital media, it's really an easy learning process in terms of just learning the tool. Might take a couple of weeks to learn the ins and outs. But the main thing is drawing, and that's, we're learning how to break things down. We're learning some design aspects, and those are things that take a lot of time and practice, even more than just learning a program. From here, I'm just double checking my composition as a whole. I'm constantly looking at my thumbnail. If I was doing this, let's say a full on digital painting or an environment piece of some sort, I would actually be zooming in and out quite a bit. But I'm keeping it this size just so it relates to just drawing traditionally. But if you are drawing traditionally, I would advise to stand back away from it as far as you can so you can prop your sketch on a table or a chair and just go around maybe 20 feet away from your picture just so you can see your overall placement. You want to see if it's really close to your thumbnail sketch and that you're getting the proportions correct. So a lot of things I'll be checking will be how well you guys are drawing through the forms, measuring out your angles, checking for placement, and also just the overall design quality of your choices that you're making. Whether, especially if you crop your images, kind of see the balance here and there. Okay, so from here, I'm gonna lower the opacity of the block-in layer. If you're using traditional media, again, you could use a second piece of tracing paper on top of your existing drawing. That way you can practice on line work. Now that everything's blocked in, I'm going to focus on the objects um, that we can actually see. So I'm marking off the ends of the ellipse, and I'm blocking in the cube. For those of you using Photoshop or a similar digital media, just stick to round brushes for now. Don't get too fancy with texture brushes. Just stick with very default brushes for drawing, because we don't want the medium to fight against us. You want to mimic, some, things that are close to pen and pencil. What you'll see me doing here is implementing a lot of the exercises from week 1, making straight lines and curves, trying to get them in as few strokes as I can. And if I miss, I'll just quickly erase it. For those of you that are very comfortable with varying your line widths, you could do that as well. So you could think about thick to thin lines and not just one uniform line. If you've already taken a dynamic sketching course, that's something that we emphasize in that class. Now, a lot of it just has to do with making overlaps read, making things feel like there's more depth by just pure line work. So this image was done in real time, and just thinking about, again, starting with a composition all the way to a rough placement of the objects themselves, implementing all the steps, and then really taking my time just refining the line work with the next overall layer. As usual, just double check your work. Make sure it's where you are happy with it in terms of placement, line quality, proportion, composition. So you see me here turning off the layers just so I can double check the final outlook of this image. So for homework on this last part, I just want to see at least 3 thumbnails and 1 finished line work of your chosen image and still life. So I hope you learned quite a bit from this demonstration as I walked you through it. And again, feel free to do this either traditionally or digitally. Here is a quick overview of the expected homework for this week. So I want to see at least 1 page of box and pyramid forms, all the steps we've covered for chapter 1. I would also like to see a page of ellipses, and treat this like in week 1 where you're doing the circle shapes. You want to get the flow of getting the shape all the way around. And from there, once you've filled out the ellipses and got warmed up, you'll do at least 1 page of rounded forms. Now, there are more rounded forms than there are box and pyramid forms, so I would highly suggest doing at least 2 pages if you can for the rounded forms, because you're going to have cones, cylinders, and spheres. So after the warm-up of getting the hang of those forms, you're going to go into tracing a couple of images. I've gone ahead and provided plenty of images to choose from, ranging from simple to complex still life objects. Just to warm up, I would highly recommend using one just like in my demo, where it's a lot simpler in terms of geoforms. But then when you need a challenge for the second one, go ahead and pick something with more complexity in each object. After that, you can set up your own still life or pick from one of the provided still life images in order to do an observational drawing. However, I'd like you to at least do 3 thumbnails when approaching your drawing, just like we've covered in week 2. If you need to do more than 3 thumbnails, please include them in your final turn-in. And just like the notes suggest, make sure you include the photos of the traced images that you've used, and also the still life that you've either taken yourself or used from the provided lecture notes. Other than that, good luck this week and have fun with the homework.